The suitcase hits the porch before I do. Not placed, not handed, dropped. Like the extra half-second of effort required to extend it toward me was more than I was worth. I hear the thud before I fully understand what's happening. I'm still standing in the doorway in socks, no shoes, no coat, nothing on my feet except the thin cotton pair I'd been wearing inside, when the suitcase lands on the welcome mat and my husband steps back into the house and says, flatly and without looking at me, "Take it." Then the door shuts. I don't move for a moment. Not because I am waiting in any real sense. Not because I think the door is about to open again. But because the brain does something when it receives information it wasn't prepared for. It pauses. It replays. It tries to find the version of what just happened that makes sense. The porch light is on. The motion sensor one I installed 2 summers ago when I noticed the old fixture was corroded. It hums quietly above me. The suitcase is at my feet. Inside it, 2 days of clothes. My phone charger. A folder of documents I had pulled from the filing cabinet before the conversation became this. Everything else is behind the locked door. I stand on the porch and I wait for the lock to turn. Not because I expect it to, but because 12 years of a life have to be dissolved somehow and I haven't had time to understand that tonight is how. 12 years. The door is painted the green color I picked out from paint chips spread on the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in our 3rd year of marriage. I held each chip against the door frame for 20 minutes trying to get it right. I cared about that color. I spent 45 minutes at the hardware store making sure we matched the trim. The porch railing I sanded and repainted in year 7 because the wood was starting to look worn. 3 weekends and my right arm hurt for a week after. The window box with the herbs I grow. The rosemary is doing well this year. It always comes back. I am looking at all of this from the outside. From a few feet away, as a person who no longer has access to any of it, and it occurs to me in the particular way that enormous things occur, very slowly, then all at once, that I am not going to get back in tonight. The lock is not going to turn. I pick up the suitcase. I step off the porch. The last thing he said to me before the door shut was, "You'll figure it out." 4 words. That was the sum of what 12 years of marriage owed me when it ended. 4 words delivered in the tone of voice you use for something that has already stopped being your concern, not cold exactly, just finished. Like a transaction that has been completed and no longer requires his attention. You'll figure it out. I have been thinking about those words since I stepped off the porch. They assumed failure. They assumed that saying it that way, with that particular bored certainty, was a kind of cruelty I was supposed to feel. Like he was telling me the ending before I had a chance to try. But underneath the cruelty, those 4 words also contained something he didn't intend to give me. A direction, a challenge, a sentence that, if I was paying attention, and I have always been paying attention, was actually the most useful thing he had ever said to me. I was going to figure it out. Not the way he meant, barely, with difficulty, hopefully crawling back. The other way. The one he didn't see coming because he had spent 12 years making himself comfortable with a version of me that was never the full picture. I start walking. The night air hits me when I reach the end of the driveway. October. Cold in the way that October is cold, not brutal yet, but the kind of air that knows what's coming and has started to mean it. I am in socks. The concrete is cold through the thin fabric and within 2 steps my feet ache and I think, briefly and almost with detachment, that I need shoes and I don't have shoes and the shoes I own are all inside a house I can no longer access. This is what getting kicked out of your own home looks like. Not fire and shouting and neighbors watching. Just a woman in a driveway in socks, a suitcase at her side, the porch light humming behind her. I look back at the house. The lights are on. The television flickers. He's already moved on to the next part of his evening. I have been resolved so quickly. I pick up the suitcase and walk. The pavement is cold and rough through my socks, but I keep moving because standing still is worse. At the corner I stop and take out my phone. I need to call someone. I go through names in my head and feel, with terrible clarity, how alone I actually am. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you who I became. My name is Audrey Sinclair. I am 39 years old. I spent 12 years as the wife of a man named Philip Cross, who builds and manages commercial real estate and is very good at making himself sound like the most important person in any room. My husband kicked me out with nothing. 6 months later, he knocked on my door and saw who answered. I was not nothing. I want to say that clearly, because the night on the porch in socks could be read as the story of a woman who had nothing. That is the version Philip believed. That is the version he had been building for years, quietly, steadily, with the patient confidence of someone who has decided what the truth is and is simply waiting for everyone around them to agree. But I had built things. Behind his name and inside the invisible margins of our life together, I had built things. It took me 6 months to understand the full scope of what I had. 2 weeks to understand I wasn't finished. One night, in a cheap motel room with sore feet, a folder of documents, and $47 in cash. To understand that the ending he thought he had given me was not actually an ending. It was a beginning he had handed me by mistake. The marriage didn't start the way it ended. I need to say that too, because the honest version of this story requires it. Philip was not always the man who drops a suitcase on a porch and walks away. He was someone different in the beginning, or at least he showed me a version of himself that I had no reason not to believe was real. He was ambitious. That part was always true. But in the early years, the ambition felt like shared momentum. Like something we were building toward together. He had ideas, energy, and a vision for where things could go. I had organizational ability, a sharp eye for contracts, and the patient attention to detail that makes things function when enthusiasm alone is not enough. We were good together. In the beginning, what I didn't understand, what takes years to see, was that the relationship was slowly changing shape. Not overnight, not in any single moment, but gradually, the way water changes stone. What we called partnership began to mean something different. What he called building together began to mean that he built and I supported. I didn't see it while it was happening. I was too busy making it work. That is, I think, how it always goes. In the beginning he used to tell people I was the reason things ran. He said it at dinner parties, to investors, to friends. He would put his arm around me and say, "She's the one who keeps everything from falling apart," and he meant it then, I think. I believed him. I believed what we were building acknowledged both of us. That the practical, unglamorous work of managing the infrastructure of our life was seen and valued. It took me a long time to notice when this stopped. Not the facts of it stopping, the facts were gradual and easy to rationalize. He got busier. The business grew. His name got bigger in his industry and there were more people to impress and more events to attend, and I became, in the narrative he was building about himself, less of a partner and more of a feature of his personal life that he mentioned occasionally and thought about rarely. What took longer to notice was the internal shift. The point where he had stopped seeing me accurately and had replaced what was true with what was convenient. He made me small in his mind. And then he tried to make me small in mine. The jokes started around year 5. Looking back, I can trace them precisely, the specific shift from, "She's the reason things run," to the quieter, more corrosive version. The version where he'd say, at a dinner, in front of people, "She'd be lost without me. She's not really a business person." And everyone would laugh, including me sometimes, because laughing was easier than stopping it and because the first few times I genuinely thought it was harmless. It wasn't harmless. Jokes like that are never harmless. They build a picture. The way wallpaper builds a room, one strip at a time, until you can't see the wall underneath. Every time someone heard Philip say I wasn't capable of independent financial thought, it added to the picture. Slowly the picture became what people believed, including, for a while, me. Because here is what sustained ridicule does, it doesn't break you all at once. It just makes you quieter. It makes you smaller in rooms where you should be present. It makes you doubt things you used to be certain of. It turns your strengths into things you apologize for instead of things you rely on. By year 9 or 10, I had stopped correcting him when he was wrong about things I knew. That was when I understood something was seriously wrong. The work I did for us was real. I want to be exact about this. When we first started living together, Philip's business was generating revenue but not reliably. He had a tendency, charming in small doses, catastrophic in large ones, of saying yes to things he hadn't fully planned for and then scrambling to make them work. I became the scramble manager. The person who saw the gap between what he'd promised and what was possible and found the path between them. I handled his scheduling, reviewed his contracts, Caught 2 expensive errors in the first 6 months. Managed the household finances with a precision he didn't bother to understand, which meant we were saving money he didn't know we were saving. I also left my own job, a mid-level position at an insurance company where I had real prospects, because he needed more support than he was admitting. I made that trade. I made it consciously, I told myself. I told myself it was temporary. It was not temporary. What it was, I realized much later, was the moment the balance shifted in a direction it never fully corrected. I stopped having my own career. I started having his. And he let that happen so naturally that I don't think he ever acknowledged it had happened at all. The financial arrangement was the quietest part. Philip handled money as a domain that belonged to his judgment. In the beginning this seemed like efficiency. He earned, I manage. There was a logic to the division. But over time the division became a wall. He had accounts I had no access to. Just arranged such that they were his, and the household account was what he gave me to work with, which I did with considerable skill. What he failed to notice, because he wasn't paying attention, was that my considerable skill included keeping my own records. I tracked everything, every transfer, every household expense, every month's snapshot of what came in and what went out. I kept a spreadsheet, and then when that felt insufficient, I kept a folder, and then a second folder, and then I organized the whole thing in a way that was, functionally, a complete financial record of our life together. Not because I was planning anything. I am organized by nature. The records existed because I could not help making records. But on the night I sat in a motel room in socks with $47, those records were the most important thing in the folder I had pulled from the filing cabinet. They existed, and they were mine. By the time Philip threw me out, the isolation had been going on for years. Not isolation in a dramatic sense. Isolation the way successful men sometimes isolate their partners, through social positioning, through being the more prominent person at every event until people related to our life through him and treated me as an extension. Through controlling the story of who we were such that when I expressed a different version, I seemed like the confused one. My friendships had narrowed, not because Philip had forbidden anything. Because the social landscape of our life was structured around his relationships, his colleagues, his network. My old friends had drifted. New friends were really his contacts who included me by association. I had one friend who was genuinely mine. A woman named Winifred, who I had known since before Philip, who had watched the whole arc of the marriage from a careful distance and who had never once said, "I told you so," even though she had, in fact, told me so in year 4 and year 6 and year 9. Winifred's number was the one I found in my phone on the corner that cold October night. I called her. She answered on the second ring. She didn't ask what happened. She just said, "Where are you?" I told her. "Stay there," she said. "I'm coming." Winifred brought shoes. That is the first thing I remember about the night after the porch. She arrived in her car within 20 minutes and the first thing she did when I got in was hand me a pair of sneakers she had grabbed from her hall closet, an old pair she kept for gardening that were slightly too big but infinitely better than socks on pavement. She didn't say much on the drive. She's that kind of person, the kind who knows when presence matters more than words. We drove to a motel she knew, a decent one, not fancy but clean and safe, and she paid for 2 nights while I was still processing the logistics and said I could pay her back whenever. That night, after she left, I sat on the bed in the motel room and went through the folder. I had grabbed it almost by instinct. Years of organization had made that folder a reflex. Inside were copies of things I had accumulated. Tax records, household account statements, notes from conversations I had written down out of habit, and older things, documents from early in the marriage when Philip and I had made formal agreements about things and I had kept copies because I keep copies of everything. I went through it all. Slowly. What I found made the cold recede slightly. The first thing I confirmed that night was the personal account. I had opened it in year 7. I told Philip briefly. He nodded in the distracted way he nodded at things he had decided weren't his concern. I opened it because I had started, around that time, to feel uneasy in a way I couldn't fully articulate and because I had learned, from years of financial management, that the first principle of stability is having something that is entirely yours. I put money in it consistently. Small amounts, because small amounts don't draw attention and because I wasn't making my own income and I had to work within the household budget I managed. But consistently, every month, for 5 years, I moved a modest amount into that account and I watched it grow the way I watch everything I tend. $47 in my wallet that night. And something quite different in that account. Not life-changing money, but enough for a deposit, enough to breathe, enough to make choices rather than react. Seeing it that night, in that motel room, confirming it existed, that it was mine, felt like finding a handhold on the side of a cliff. I held onto it. The second thing I found in the folder was older. From year 2, when Philip and I set up a joint holding entity for a property deal that fell through. The entity had been filed in both our names and never formally dissolved. I had been the one to set it up. I had been the one to draft the operating language. Because that is what I do. Philip had forgotten it existed. I knew this because in year 8, in a conversation about our financial picture, he had described our assets in a way that didn't include it. He simply did not remember it was there. It was too small, too old, too buried under the larger things he tracked. It was not too small for my purposes. It was a vehicle, something with my name on it, in a state filing that predated most of the problems in our marriage. I had the documents in the folder because I kept documents. I am organized by nature. He had spent years treating that quality as proof I was a supporting character, not the one making real decisions. He was very wrong about that. I took out a legal pad and started writing. The first weeks were hard. I want to be honest about that, because the version of this story where leaving a bad marriage is immediately liberating is not the true version. The true version includes the motel, and then the room I rented in a house with 2 other women, and the uncertainty of waking up in a space that didn't belong to me and feeling the specific vulnerability of a person who has lost their footing and hasn't yet found it again. I got a job within the first week. Not a good job for someone with my background. A job at a property management office that needed an administrative coordinator. I applied with a resume I rewrote in the motel room and interviewed 2 days after Philip dropped a suitcase on the porch. I got it because I am good at what I do. The pay was modest and the work was not challenging in a way that used my full abilities, but it came with something I needed more than a salary. A schedule, a desk, a structure that was entirely separate from anything Philip controlled. I went every day. I stayed late when there was work to stay late for. I did not let myself fall apart during business hours. I was saving that for the nights. The nights were a different thing. I had my own small room with a single window, a second-hand lamp, and a dresser I had bought for $35 at an estate sale and carried up the stairs myself. It was the smallest room I had lived in since my 20s. I loved it in a way I hadn't expected to love a room. Everything in it was mine. The lamp was mine. The dresser was mine. The small photograph of my mother I'd set on top of it was mine. The folder of documents was mine, in the closet, in the organized system I'd established within days of moving in because I cannot inhabit a space without organizing it. At night, when the day was done and I had finished whatever I needed to finish and the house was quiet, I would sit at the small desk by the window and work. Not on the job, on the next thing. I was building a plan that used everything I had. The account, the entity, the records, the expertise I had gathered over 12 years of managing things Philip got the credit for. I spent those nights like someone studying for an exam they know is coming. I was preparing for the version of my life that came after the motel and the small room. At the property management office, I met a woman named Sable. She was the office manager, had been there for 11 years, and had a way of watching new employees that reminded me of the way I watch situations, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. She watched me work for 2 weeks and then offered to teach me the back-end systems. I learned them in 3 days. She noticed. By week 6 she was asking my opinion on vendor negotiations. By week 8 we were having lunch together regularly. She knew I was going through something. I didn't give her details. But she knew the shape of it. A woman who showed up immaculately organized with a slightly too good resume has recently needed a soft landing. She didn't ask. I told her a little, eventually. She told me something in return, that her own company, which she ran on the side, needed someone with financial and contract review skills and she had been doing it alone for 2 years and it was becoming too much. She showed me the books. I made 3 recommendations in the first 15 minutes. She laughed and said, "When can you start?" 4 months after the night on the porch, things looked different. I still lived in the small room. I still worked at the property management office during the day. But I was also, officially, a part-time financial consultant to Sable's side company, which turned out to be a residential staging and renovation coordination business with 12 active clients and a structure that needed exactly the kind of attention I was good at giving. The money was better, not immediately transformative. I'm telling the real version of this, not a fantasy, but meaningfully better. Enough to start thinking about the next step. Enough that the personal account, combined with the new income, was beginning to accumulate towards something. I had also, through careful, methodical research that I did in the evenings at my small desk, begun to understand what the dormant entity from year 2 could be used for. I had spoken, cautiously, to a small business attorney who did a free initial consultation and who told me that the entity was still in good standing, that its status was clear, and that it was a legitimate vehicle for business activity. This was information I added to the rest. I was not rushing. I had learned, from years of managing complex situations, that the impulse to rush is almost always the most expensive one. I was building carefully, methodically, the way you build things that are meant to last. The plan was coming into shape. 5 months after the porch, I signed a lease. A small apartment, somewhere different, a part of the city I had always liked but never lived in, close to a market and a park. 1 bedroom, clean lines, a kitchen I organized, a window facing east for morning sun. I bought a plant for the windowsill. Rosemary. Winifred helped me move in on a Saturday. We carried boxes up 1 flight of stairs and assembled a bookshelf from a flat pack and drank bad coffee from a gas station on the way, and she said, "At some point in the afternoon, I want you to know that I have never in all the years I've known you seen you look this like yourself." I thought about that for a long time. What she meant was that the managed smallness, the quiet self-erasure of someone who has spent too long in a life that required her to be less, was going. I felt it going, not all at once, in increments, in the daily small decisions of a person who is responsible only to herself and her own judgment and her own taste and her own sense of what matters. The apartment was mine, no one's name on the lease but mine. I stood in the empty living room and felt something settle into place I hadn't felt in years. Something that was simply me. 6 weeks after signing the lease, I got the call from Philip's lawyer. It was about the entity. The dormant entity from year 2, which I had quietly reactivated and which had recently taken on a small contract, nothing significant, but documented, active, generating a paper trail of activity in both our names since we were both still listed. He wanted to negotiate a buyout of my interest. I had expected this. Philip is attentive to his own finances in the specific way of men who think money protects them rather than something they share. When something entered his financial picture that he hadn't authorized, he noticed immediately. The entity had entered his picture. I let the lawyer make the opening offer. It was low. I waited a week. Then I made a counter. Not aggressive, precise. Based on valuation methodology I had researched carefully, citing the entity's standing and the income potential I had spent 6 weeks establishing. The lawyer came back a week later with a substantially higher number. I let him wait 3 more days. Then I accepted. The settlement was not enormous. But it was real, documented, mine. And it funded the thing I had been building toward. I registered the business 2 weeks before Philip knocked on my door. A small consulting firm. Financial and operational consulting for small residential property businesses, a specific niche I had identified because I understood it deeply, had spent 12 years working in it from the inside, and because Sable's business had given me a living proof of concept that there was a market for someone with my exact background. The name was mine. The structure was clean. The first 2 clients were referrals from Sable, who had described me to them as the most organized person she had ever worked with and who was clearly building towards something bigger than an administrative coordinator position. She was right. I was building towards something. Winifred came over the night I filed the paperwork with wine and pasta. We sat at my thrift shop table I had refinished myself and talked until late. She said, "The wildest part? You built all of this out of what he thought was nothing. He handed you nothing and you quietly built something and he has no idea." She was right. He had no idea. He was about to find out. The knock came on a Tuesday evening in late March. 6 months and 2 weeks after the night on the porch. I heard it from the kitchen where I was finishing a contract review. The apartment was warm. Music was playing from a small speaker on the bookshelf. I knew who it was before I opened the door. Not with certainty, not in any supernatural way. Just with the particular knowing that comes from understanding someone's behavior over 12 years. The way I had always understood things about Philip that he didn't understand about himself. I knew he was having difficulties. I had heard, through the normal channels that information travels, a mutual contact, a detail Winifred had mentioned, something I had observed from the entity negotiation, that the business wasn't running as smoothly without the organizational infrastructure that had quietly kept it stable for a decade. That certain things were lapsing. That certain details were not being tracked the way they had been. This was not revenge. I had not arranged any of it. It was simply the natural result of removing the person who had been doing the invisible work and discovering that the work had been more than invisible, it had been essential. I set down my contract review. I walked to the door. I opened it. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, Philip is a tall man and he was still tall. But a quality of certainty that had always been his most prominent feature, the confidence of a man who believes the room will reorganize around him, was less solid. He was wearing the good jacket. The one he wore to important meetings. He had dressed up to come see me. I noticed that. Audrey, he said. Philip, I said. He looked past me into the apartment, scanning for information, assessing on his own terms before the conversation started. He saw the apartment, the lamp, the bookshelf, the papers from my contract review. The plant on the windowsill, the rosemary, doing very well. He saw, on the side table by the door, the business cards I had printed 2 weeks ago for the firm. He picked one up. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at me. I watched him reprocess something. I could see it happening, the moment when the version of me he had been carrying in his mind, the one that needed to figure things out, the one who would barely manage, encountered the version of me that was actually standing in this doorway. They did not match. He said he needed to talk. I was not surprised. I stood in the doorway and I looked at him and I thought about the porch and the socks and the suitcase, and the lock that didn't turn, and the 4 words that were supposed to be my ending. I thought about the motel and the folder and the account and the legal pad and the small room with the lamp and Winifred and Sable and the apartment and the business and the lease with my name on it and the rosemary in the window that came back every year. I thought about 6 months. Then I said, I'm listening. He talked. He talked about the business, about things that weren't running the way they had, about operational details that had slipped, about the structural picture of certain accounts. He talked in the careful way of someone who has thought carefully before asking. He was looking for something from me, help, access, a version of what I had been before. I listened to everything he said. I did not interrupt. When he finished I said, I understand. He waited. You can contact my business, I said. I consult on exactly this kind of work. My rates are on the card. He stared at me for a moment. The way you stare at a thing you thought you understood and have just discovered you never understood at all. Then I closed the door. Not dramatically, just closed it the way you close a door when a conversation is finished and you have somewhere to be. The contract review was waiting. The client needed it by Thursday. I had work to do. I went back to the kitchen and picked up the contract where I had left off. From outside, I heard his car eventually start and pull away. I thought about the night on the porch. The suitcase hitting the concrete. The socks. The cold. The certainty in his voice when he said I'd figure it out, as if the sentence was a door he was closing on something finished. He was right, I would figure it out. He was wrong about everything else. I had figured out the account, the entity, the settlement, the job and then the consulting and then the firm with the business cards on the side table. I had figured out that what he called nothing was a skill set, a record, and 12 years of knowing how things worked from the inside. I had figured out that the door he closed was not the only door. I found my own. I opened it, and it turned out the view from that side was considerably better.